Sometimes, what looks like the worst punishment can turn out to be life's biggest blessing. In a crowded hall, a young obese girl was humiliated and handed over to a poor farmer, treated like a burden no one wanted. Villagers laughed, her family mocked, and everyone thought her life was ruined forever. But fate had its own plan. Behind the farmer's worn clothes and silent nature was a secret that could change her life forever. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of a journey that would shock everyone. The landlord's mansion was filled with restless murmurs that evening. A crowd of villagers packed tightly into the grand hall. The oil lamps flickered against the tall walls, their dim glow casting long shadows that seemed to mock the girl standing in the middle. Sana, with her large frame and timid posture, looked down at the floor, her heart pounding so loudly she could hardly hear the voices around her. Her uncle, the wealthy and arrogant landlord, stood proudly on the dais, sneering as if he were delivering a judgment in a court of law. "This girl," he spat, pointing at Sana, "is a shame to our family. She eats more than she works. She cannot walk without panting. She cannot lift without trembling. And she is a disgrace to my household. For too long I have tolerated her idleness, her size, her weakness. But tonight, she will be punished." The crowd reacted with gasps, then with chuckles, then finally with cruel laughter. Some women whispered, "Look at her, she can't even look up, what use is she?" Men smirked and nudged one another, mocking her round face, her heavy figure, the way her shawl barely covered her trembling shoulders. Sana's eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had endured these insults her whole life, yet tonight they cut deeper than ever. Her uncle raised his hand for silence, his eyes glinting with malice. "From this day forward," he declared, "she will no longer sit under my roof, eat from my grain, or shame my name. Instead," he paused dramatically, scanning the hall, "she will be given to the poorest farmer in this village. Let him make her toil for every grain of rice. Let her eat from his scraps. Let her be his burden." The hall erupted with laughter. Women shook their heads in pity, children giggled, and men jeered. To them, it was entertainment, a cruel show at Sana's expense. Sana finally lifted her gaze, her tearful eyes searching desperately for even one sympathetic face, but all she saw was ridicule. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Then the landlord gestured to the corner of the hall. A man stepped forward. His clothes were worn and patched, his beard thick, his face sun-darkened from long hours in the fields. His hands were calloused, his eyes steady but quiet. He looked like someone who lived on the edge of survival. "This man," the landlord announced, "is Salim. He will take her. From tonight, she belongs to him." Salim didn't speak. He simply nodded once, his face unreadable. Sana wanted to cry out, to protest, to beg her uncle for mercy. But something inside her froze. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps exhaustion. She bit her lip and lowered her head, knowing no plea would change his decision. The guards nudged her forward. The laughter followed her like a storm as she stepped down from the hall and out into the cool night. Every sound of ridicule rang in her ears. Her uncle's triumphant smirk burned in her memory. Her heart felt heavier than her body, each step like a stone dragging her deeper into despair. Outside, a small wooden cart waited. Salim climbed onto the seat, took hold of the reins, and motioned for her to join him. Sana obeyed silently, clutching her shawl around her as though it could shield her from the stares of the villagers still gathered at the doorway. The horse began to move, the wheels creaking against the dirt road. The mansion grew smaller behind them, the echoes of cruel laughter fading into the distance. The road stretched endlessly into the countryside, fields rolling on either side under the pale moonlight. Sana sat with her eyes fixed on her lap, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She had never felt so unwanted, so discarded, so utterly alone. Salim said nothing as he guided the horse steadily forward. His silence was neither cruel nor kind, just unreadable. Sana stole one glance at him. His profile was rugged, his clothes humble, his hands rough. But there was something in his stillness she couldn't understand. He did not look at her with pity, nor with scorn. He simply drove the cart as though carrying a responsibility he had quietly accepted. Sana's chest tightened. Was this her fate now? To live in poverty, to eat scraps, to be a punishment on a poor man's shoulders? She hugged her shawl tighter, her eyes glistening. In her heart, she believed her life was over, but far beyond the fields, beyond the nights. Silence. Destiny was already weaving a story that neither she nor the villagers could ever imagine. The cart rattled along the dusty road until it finally came to a stop before a small, simple home surrounded by fields. Sana lifted her eyes, expecting to see broken walls, piles of dirt and misery, but what she saw surprised her. The hut was modest, yes, with mud-plastered walls and a thatched roof, but it was neat, cared for. A few chickens scratched at the ground nearby, and a pair of strong bulls rested under a tree. Smoke rose gently from the outdoor stove, and rows of crops stretched into the darkness like waves frozen in time. Salim climbed down from the cart, unfastened the horse, and looked at her with calm eyes. "Go inside. You can rest there tonight," he said simply, before walking away to tie the horse. His voice was not cruel, not mocking, just steady. Sana nodded faintly, clutching her shawl, and stepped into the small house. Inside, she found a charpoy covered with a simple sheet, clay pots stacked neatly in one corner, and a small lantern flickering on the floor. It was not luxury, but it was not the misery she had feared either. That night she lay awake, her thoughts tangled. The echo of her uncle's words still rang in her ears. Punishment, burden, shame. Yet, this place did not feel like punishment. It felt real, honest. And though Salim had said little, his silence carried no cruelty. She drifted into uneasy sleep, unsure of what awaited her. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Salim's voice woke her. "Here," he said, handing her a clay pot. "The well is down the path. Bring water." Sana blinked in confusion. No one had ever asked her to do chores before. At home, she was ridiculed for being too slow, too heavy, too clumsy, so she was kept out of the way. Now, for the first time, someone expected her to contribute. The pot was heavier than she imagined, and her arms ached as she carried it. She stumbled, spilled some water, and returned breathless, ashamed. She braced for scolding, but Salim only said, "You'll get stronger with time. Try again tomorrow." His calmness surprised her. In the days that followed, Sana learned to work. She swept the yard, chopped vegetables, and tried her hand at kneading dough. Her movements were awkward at first, but slowly she grew steadier. Salim showed her how to milk the cows, how to scatter grain for the chickens, how to light the stove properly so smoke didn't fill the hut. Every evening her body ached, her hands blistered, yet there was a strange satisfaction in her exhaustion. For the first time in her life she felt useful, but something about Salim puzzled her. He was not what he appeared. Though his clothes were rough and his house small, there were signs, subtle but impossible to ignore. He had more animals than any poor farmer could afford. His bulls were well-fed, strong, and expensive. The tools in his shed were polished, sturdy, and neatly arranged. And sometimes, he disappeared at dawn on horseback, returning only after hours, his eyes filled with thoughts he never shared. One morning, her curiosity overcame her fear. She followed him quietly, keeping her distance as he rode beyond the hut. What she saw made her heart freeze in astonishment. Beyond the small patch of land near his house stretched an ocean of fields, golden wheat swaying in the wind, orchards heavy with fruit, herds of cattle grazing peacefully. Dozens of workers moved about, carrying tools and baskets, bowing respectfully as Salim passed. Their voices called out, not with mockery, but with reverence. "Malik Sahib! Malik Sahib!" Sana gasped softly. Malik Sahib. She watched as he spoke with the workers, giving them instructions with the confidence of a leader. His simple clothes had fooled her, but there was no doubt now. This man was no poor farmer. He was the master of thousands of acres, the silent owner of wealth beyond her imagination. Her knees felt weak as she returned to the hut, her mind spinning. All this time she had thought she was his burden, but the truth was something else, entirely. When he came back later that evening, she could no longer contain her questions. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you live here, in this small hut, when you own all of that? Why do you dress like this when you could live like a king?" Salim looked at her quietly, then smiled faintly. "Because wealth means nothing if you forget the value of work. If I lived in the mansion, I'd lose myself in comfort. Here I live simply, so I remember my roots, and I can see who respects me for me, not for my land." Sana stared at him, stunned. For the first time, she felt her heart stir with something unfamiliar. Admiration, respect, and perhaps a spark of hope that her life, given away as punishment, was not the end, but the beginning of something far greater. The days melted into weeks, and weeks into months, until Sana no longer recognized the girl who had once trembled in her uncle's mansion. Her body grew stronger from dawn to dusk work, her hands toughened by soil and water, her steps lighter, with every task she completed. She woke with the roosters, tied her dupatta firmly, and stepped into the fields without hesitation. The woman who once hid behind shame was now leading goats to pasture, lifting buckets of water and guiding workers on how to prepare the meals. But the transformation wasn't just in her body. Inside, a fire had been lit. For the first time in her life, Sana felt a sense of purpose. She was not a burden. She was not useless. Each seed she pressed into the soil, each cow she milked, each basket of fruit she carried was proof of her worth. And she knew Salim saw it too. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Salim called the workers together in the largest field. Sana, carrying a basket of vegetables, walked up just in time to hear his voice ring out. "This woman," he said, gesturing to her, "was sent to me as a punishment. She was given away like a broken object, unwanted and unloved. But she has proven something far greater than her uncle or anyone in that hall ever imagined. She has shown courage, patience, and strength. Today she is not my burden. She is my partner." The workers clapped, some smiling warmly, others nodding with respect. Sana stood frozen, her eyes wide, her throat tight. Partner. No one had ever spoken of her like that before. She had been mocked, insulted, rejected, but never honored. Tears blurred her vision, and she quickly lowered her gaze, afraid the workers would see her cry. Later that night, as she sat by the lantern's glow, she thought about Salim's words again and again. Her heart swelled with gratitude. This man, who could have mocked her like everyone else, had instead given her dignity. But the real test of her newfound strength came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, her uncle himself arrived on horseback with a group of men. He looked around with his usual arrogance, sneering at the fields, at the workers, and finally at Sana. "So," he scoffed, "here you are. Tell me, are you starving yet? Has the farmer thrown you out for eating too much? Are you crawling back to me in tears?" His men chuckled at his cruel words, waiting for Sana to break. But Sana did not bow her head this time. She did not tremble. She stood tall, her hands firm on her hips, her eyes blazing with confidence. "No, uncle," she said clearly, her voice steady enough to silence the mocking laughter. "I am not starving. I am thriving. You thought you punished me, but you gave me the greatest gift of my life. You threw me away as a burden, but here I found dignity. Here I found respect. And here I found a man who values me, not for my body, not for my size, but for my soul." The workers behind her nodded in agreement, their faces stern. Salim stepped forward, his presence commanding, and added, "She is not your shame. She is not your burden. She is my strength, and I will not let you or anyone else insult her again." Her uncle's face turned red with fury, but the truth hung in the air like a sword. The villagers who had once laughed at Sana now looked at her with admiration. The girl they had mocked was standing taller than anyone among them, her voice silencing the cruelty that had haunted her since childhood. Unable to respond, Her uncle turned his horse sharply and rode away, his men following, their silence heavy with defeat. Sana stood there, the wind tugging at her dupatta, the fields glowing under the afternoon sun. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with pride. She had faced the man who humiliated her and walked away victorious, not because of revenge, but because of the life she had built, the person she had become. As the sky darkened, she walked back toward the hut with Salim at her side. For the first time she felt her steps were not heavy but filled with purpose. She was no longer the girl whispered about with mockery. She was a woman reborn, a woman of strength, dignity, and respect. The fields stretched endlessly before her, alive, with crops and promise. And in her heart, she knew this was not the end of her story. It was the true beginning.